Right. So nice to see you guys, and I know some people can join us who are going to be watching later. It might seem like a strange time to kind of take time out to learn some Zohar, but actually there's no strange time, I think, to learn some Zohar. And in particular, it's fitting because there's a huge amount of stuff about Yom Kippur. And as Yom Kippur, of course, begins on Wednesday night, seemed appropriate to take a look at a chunk of that. So I think everyone who's been here before has done some Zohar with me before, so I can probably skip the introduction about what the Zohar is. If you have questions, just shout them out. But grabbed quite a long and interesting text for us to look at. I'm not sure if we'll get through the whole thing, about what happens on Yom Kippur. The basis of it, as always with the Zohar, is something in rabbinic literature. In this case, the statement is one from the Talmud and elsewhere, but particularly in the Talmud on Rosh Hashanah. It describes what we're doing on the high holidays as scaring away and or feeding the evil forces in the universe. Right? The shofar is described as a kind of terrifying sound that the demonic forces run away from, and we blow it 100 times in order to keep them at bay so that we can get our prayers in. That gets expanded upon considerably in the Zohar into this whole alternate conception of what Yom Kippur is, in which there's pretty big role to play for Satan, Hasatan, the adversary. It verges to some degree on kind of Christian type language around God and the devil and their war over souls. And that's partially what's interesting about it, because you don't see that too many other places in Jewish literature. But it also diverges from that in interesting ways as well, in terms of understanding what tshuva is all about, what's happening in the background, right? The assumption of the Zohar is always that there's more going on than it seems. And Yom Kippur is no exception to that. So, as we usually do, I figure I'll share the text on screen here. I've just taken a scan of the Pritzker version. We're looking at a section from Parashat Emor, which, although not exactly in the right place, talks a lot about Yom Kippur. And we're just going to try and get a sense from this of what Yom Kippur is to the Zohar. That's, I think, the main question, because it might not be what we conventionally think of Yom Kippur as. So I'll share this, and as we often do, as is our custom, perhaps we'll kind of take turns reading aloud and discussing if that's okay. You'll see on many of these pages there's not much text and a lot of commentary, which we'll also reference as we need to, but we're going to focus primarily on the text. Any questions about that? Okay. So we begin in the middle of an extended teaching, had to kind of start somewhere not quite arbitrary, but ignore some of the material before it. But it's a ongoing discussion between the rabbis about who the Hasatan is. Right? In the Torah, Hasatan is only mentioned twice, and it's clearly a title, right? The adversary, or as it's translated here, the denouncer. The reason it's translated here as the denouncer is because in rabbinic literature, the figure of Hasatan, the angel whose job it is to oppose people's behavior, is often labeled not with the Hebrew word Hasatan, but with Latin-based words, and particularly categor, which was a prosecutor in the Roman legal system. So the conception of Hasatan that we already have from the language is that it is a prosecutor, someone who is beholden to the law, and whose responsibility it is to point out people's crimes and to hold them accountable for those crimes, just as it would be for anyone representing the crown in court today. And that's an interesting switch in language to some degree, because it makes it very legalistic, which we'll see it diverges from pretty quickly. Hi, Shiloh. So, Lee, you're first on my screen if you want to start reading for us. I'll just interrupt as you go. Sorry about that.
Starting just from the top of the page.
Yeah.
Not only this, but whenever the denouncer is ready and has been granted permission, we must set before him something with which he can occupy himself, so that he will leave Israel alone. On this day, the denouncer is ready to spy out the earth, as is written. YHVH said to the adversary, "From where have you come?" He answered, "From roaming the earth and walking about upon it." And we've learned what is meant by roaming the earth. Well, this refers to the denouncer, the accuser of Israel.
Okay. So, what do we know so far about this figure, and what verses and stories are they bringing in order to illustrate it for us? Does the denouncer act of his own free will and accord?
It kind of seems that way. And I was also thinking about how a lot of the patriarchs are described as kind of like walking with God or kind of like walking beside God. And there's a really interesting image of kind of this, whatever this is, roaming around on its own kind of thing, doing its own thing.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of freedom clearly that's given to it, but it does indicate that there has to be granted permission first as well. Right, the denouncer is granted permission, and then it's wandering around the earth looking for people doing bad things in order to tattle on them. It's a snitch, basically. And as a result, our response to it is what? How do we get rid of it? Distraction. Right? That's the key bit here. We must set before him something with which he can occupy himself. So that's going to be the kind of dominant mode of how we understand much of what Yom Kippur is. That we are kind of bribing or distracting the denouncer in order to get him off our tail. You know, in those movies when someone's running from a police dog and they all of a sudden like pull out a stake from their coat and they throw the stake to the side so that the dog runs to get the stake so they can get over the chain link fence, right? That's what they're imagining is happening when we're encountering the denouncer. We have to try and distract it with something, keep it busy with something so that we can get away before it actually is able to tattle on us to God. Now, the verse that they cite here, of course, you can see from the citation, Job 1:7, is the very beginning of the book of Job. Right? This is the setup for the story of the book of Job. The denouncer, there referred to as Hasatan, the adversary, shows up in heaven, and God says, "Where'd you come from?" And he says, "Oh, I was just walking around the earth. I was just having a stroll." Right? So that image, as you said, Zachary, of kind of just walking around, spying on people, very casually, is what's leading now into them understanding the denouncers being there and needing to be distracted. Okay? And you can see the language, once again, the accuser of Israel, this is legalistic language, the prosecutor, this is the plaintiff, right? Hasatan is the one who brings the claim against us. We are the defendant in the court, and God is the judge. But in order for there to be a judgment, there has to be something who brings claims on behalf of plaintiffs. And in the case of the English legal system, that's the Crown, right? Everyone here, barristers, act on behalf of the Crown, not their client. In America, it's different. You act on behalf of your client. But here, you're acting on behalf of the Crown, which is why the cases are always the Crown versus blah, 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 blah. And in some way, that's exactly how the denouncer is understood, as an agent of the Crown, whose job it is to bring claims against people for them to be judged. Robin, what do you say?
Sorry. The implication is that it's only Israel that's under judgment here, not the rest of the world. Is that?
Typically for the Zohar, it's focused on us, and in particular around the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. It's really about our actions, but it reflects the idea that we're held to a different standard, right? The adversary has agency over us because we have committed ourselves to follow the rules in a way that others have not. So we're accountable as a result if we don't follow the rules. You can see, by the way, just to point out, one of the things that Danny Matt does so well is give us the rabbinic sources. So this teaching comes from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. There's the basis of it here, right? That they gave him a bribe on Yom Kippur so he wouldn't nullify Israel's sacrifice. And of course, what that's referencing is the description of Yom Kippur in Leviticus that we read from the Torah, is that there were two goats, right? If you remember, two goats, and the high priest gets all the people to confess their sins, and then puts the people's sins on one of the goats and sends it off a cliff in the desert. And the Torah says, Azazel, to Azazel. Nobody knows what or who Azazel is, but the Zohar is assuming Azazel is another word for the demonic, another word for the adversary, another word for the baddie. And so it understands the practice of shoving that goat off the cliff as us doing the same thing as in the movies when you throw a steak to the dog in order to get over the fence. Which is not unreasonable, but probably not how we usually think about that description of the sacrifices in Leviticus.
Adam, that last sentence, what is meant by roaming the earth, what this refers to the announcer, it sounds like that's suggesting that whenever you see that phrase roaming the earth, that is always a reference then.
That seems to be the implication, although I would have to look at the other places where that's the case. Let's see if he gives us any helpful thing here in the note. This is the context, right, from Job. He gives us down here. One day the sons of Elohim came to stand before Adonai, and the adversary too came among them. So already we have a very different depiction of how God works, right? Because there's clearly a court of gods. And Adonai said to the adversary, from where have you come? And the adversary answered, saying, from roaming the earth and walking about it. And Adonai said to the adversary, have you considered my servant Job? Right? So God kind of invokes the whole Job situation by being like, what about this guy? He's so good. And of course, that provokes the adversary to try and bring a case against him. But yes, it's a good question about what exactly they mean in terms of that phrase. And they give the rest of it here.
So it sounds like the adversary, Satan, is actually working for God, as opposed to sort of, certainly to Christian belief where Satan is, the against God. He's like the fallen angel.
100%. Right, absolutely. The idea of Satan being a divine being, or in some way a kind of powerful being, which is pure evil and is opposed to God, is obviously not what we're talking about here, which is somewhat surprising if we've grown up in a Christian culture. We talk about the devil. The devil made me do it, right? And particularly in some Christian cultures, that's a much bigger thing than in others. But even in pretty mainstream Catholic and other Christian cultures, this is the plain meaning is that there is a devil. The devil tempts people, and that you either have to choose the path of the devil or the path of God. That Christian belief is probably a result of their influence from Zoroastrianism a long time ago, which was a dualistic religion where there was a good God and an evil God who were fighting against each other. And the goal of the religion was to help the good God. You can see echoes of that in Jewish texts as well. But the interesting difference, as you point out, Martin, is that actually it's very clear from the context in Job that the adversary is just a representative of God, doing what God asks, and fulfilling a very important and necessary role in the kind of court system that's envisioned. That doesn't mean he's not annoying, though. All right, it doesn't mean that we welcome him. We still want to get rid of him. Yeah, Janice.
Didn't Job not really understand at the beginning when you read it that he didn't really know what he'd done? He was sort of repenting, and and they went through all this ashes business and everything else, and they came out the other side. But he didn't quite know why he had been chosen for it all to happen.
Yeah, no, he didn't know. And the whole story of Job is God and Satan basically playing a trick on Job. Right? This is their bet about whether or not he can still be righteous when all the stuff he likes is taken away. And eventually God turns out to win the bet, but it's not a given by any means. And Job still didn't do anything wrong, right? The whole point of Job is he never did anything wrong. It's just that the dynamics of God and Satan playing this game over accusing people and judging them is acted out upon Job quite unfairly. But that's partially the point of the story, perhaps. Job is a really interesting book to look at carefully because, again, it's something we think we know, but actually it's very different when you look at it closely. And that's, again, largely a result of Christian influence in how we perceive our own texts. Okay, let's keep going. We're going to get a little bit more context for some other incident with this friend, the denouncer. Lee, do you want to read another paragraph? You're doing great.
Sure. The companions have adduced that surely at that time Israel was about to cross the Red Sea and exact retribution against the Egyptians. Satan said, I have passed through the Holy Land, and I see that these are not worthy to enter it. If you are rendering judgment, their punishment here should be like the Egyptians. What is the difference between them? Either they should all die together, or they should all return to Egypt. And wasn't it you who said they will be enslaved and afflicted 400 years? Look, out of the total, only 210 have elapsed, no more.
Okay, so they invent a meanwhile, right, in the shows where it cuts meanwhile. The meanwhile is the moment in Job, in the beginning of Job, when Hasatan returns and God says, "Where were you?" And he says, "Oh, I was just roaming the earth." The Zohar imagines that moment when he was roaming the earth was actually the moment when the Israelites were crossing the Red Sea. Okay, now the chronology doesn't really matter because it doesn't matter to the Zohar. That's what they're imagining is happening. At that moment where God goes, "Where were you?" the Israelites are about to step into the sea. And Hasatan says, "By the way, I kind of took a recce around and, they're not really fit enough to go in there. And I think you kind of know this, right?" And all Hasatan is asking for is fairness. If you're going to kill them, kill all of them, Egyptians and Israelites alike. And if you're not going to kill them, then both should be saved because they're no better than the Egyptians. They're both the same. And in a very kind of, important closing statement, Hasatan says, "By the way, you said you were going to enslave them for 400 years, but it's only been 210. Which is true, by the way. The chronology in the Torah doesn't make sense. Abraham is told his descendants will be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, but if you add up the years they were there, it's much, much fewer. Half the time. So Hasatan is just saying, listen, you're the one who said they'd be there 400 years. Maybe you're making the wrong call here. All of which are logical, reasonable, and not demonic arguments, right? It's not because he's malicious. He's not because he's out to get anyone. They're just legal arguments about the facts of the case. Anyone feel sympathetic with Hasatan here?
Well, I was thinking that it almost sounds like just in a very preliminary way that Hasatan sort of almost represents a more sort of worldly or human-like sort of intuition about the events and sort of challenging the heavenly intuition. And sort of,
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe that's because of spending all that time down on Earth, right? The nature of Hasatan's relationship with humans is that it knows them better than God does, perhaps, which is a very interesting concept, no matter what our idea of the devil is, right? That if it's something which is here, whereas God is elsewhere, then it's perhaps more familiar with us, and it knows the land, and it knows the people, and it knows and says, listen, that you're not right? They're not good enough. They're not going to do it. They're going to make mistakes, which, by the way, all true, right? They do make mistakes. It hasn't been 400 years. Why do we deserve to live and the Egyptians die? It's a very useful and difficult and kind of irritating argument, but it's a fair one, I think. Now let's see what God does. Robin, you want to read for us?
The Blessed Holy One said, "What will I do? This one needs something to keep him occupied. Isn't this the place to offer him that, so he'll leave my children alone? Ah, here's someone to keep him engaged." Immediately he said to him, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is none like him on earth." Immediately the denouncer argued back. The adversary answered Adonai, saying, "Is it for nothing that Job reveres God?"
Right. So what happened? At this moment, Israelites about to cross the sea. Hasatan appears and says, listen, I don't think this is the right call. God does what?
It distracts him.
Yeah. Panics, straight up panics, right? What am I going to do? And then decides, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll give him Job, right? Job is the meat being thrown to the dog who is chasing in this analogy, right? God is very kind of unfairly, perhaps, the one who, rather than addressing Hasatan's very valid complaints and arguments, rather than explaining, well, it's going to be 200 years because of this, and I know they're rubbish now, but they'll make it out of it, rather than addressing any of that, God decides just to try and throw Hasatan a bone to keep him distracted so he can get the people across the sea, and the bone is Job.
Is Job much later on in context?
Doesn't matter. There's no chronology for the Zohar. Job, notably in the book of Job, there's no information given about when it takes place or where. It's a parable, right? It's like there's no context. So it allows them to play with it and say that it was at the moment that the Israelites are crossing the sea, even though that's normally not how we understand it.
So can I just ask where, I'm a bit confused about where this conversation comes from. Is this just a Zohar sort of?
No, so everything in italics they're quoting from the Tanakh. In particular, it's the beginning of the book of Job.
Yeah, but the bit about if you go down to the companions have adduced and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's the Zohar imagining what Satan said at that moment. Yeah. And they're putting it in context with Job, which doesn't, as you say, Janice, naturally fit. But actually, it's kind of an interesting idea that Job was the distraction given to Hasatan to keep him from accusing the Israelites as they cross the sea. And interestingly, God clearly doesn't feel to be very powerful here. God isn't saying, you know what, piss off, Hasatan, I'm overruling you. God isn't saying, no, your arguments are wrong, here's the right arguments. God panics and tries to come up with a distraction because... why? I don't know. Doesn't want to answer the question. Doesn't have an answer to the question. I don't know. It's a very interesting picture because you get an image of Hasatan being very fair and moderate and God being panicked and throwing Job to the wolves. All right. Speaking of wolves, they're going to give us a great parable here. Robin, if you want to keep reading, you're doing great.
This may be compared to a shepherd who wanted to move his flock across a river. A wolf came to attack his flock. The shepherd was wise. He said, "What will I do? While I'm moving the lambs across, he will attack the sheep." He raised his eyes and saw among the flock one of those wild billy goats, big and strong. He said, "I'll throw this toward him, and while they're fighting each other, I'll move the whole flock across, and they will be saved from him." Shall I carry on?
Yeah.
Similarly, the Blessed Holy One said, "Surely here is a big, strong billy goat that I will throw toward him, and while he occupies himself with it, my children will cross, and the accuser will not confront them." Immediately, Adonai said to the adversary, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Until finally, the Blessed Holy One joined them together, as it is written, "Here he is in your hands, but spare his life." While he was occupied with him, he left Israel alone and did not confront them as the accuser.
Right. So, parable, shepherd, wolf, very Aesop here, trying to get the sheep and lambs across. Wolf shows up. Shepherd goes, "Oh, look, this billy goat that's here. I don't know where that came from. I'll just throw that to the wolf, and that'll keep him distracted." And the reason is because the billy goat can handle it. Right, the billy goat is strong, it's got horns, they'll fight for a while. In the meantime, I'll get all the vulnerable little lambs across the river, and the billy goat will be fine. Right, in the analogy, the billy goat is Job. And the Israelites at the time of the Exodus are the lamb. And God's saying, "Oh, you guys go across. I'll just chuck Job over there. He'll deal with Hasatan. He'll be fine. And it'll all work out." Which is interesting. Lee?
I was gonna say it's like so in this conception it's like God and Hasatan. You could paint it as being, well, showing sort of the creative aspect of God versus a more destructive aspect of Hasatan, wherein God is sort of dismissing the sort of the cold, factual, logical elements of thought that would often sort of prohibit someone from a creative endeavor. So, for example, if you want to do something creative, often if you spend too much time thinking about it, you won't actually get anywhere. And so it kind of makes me think of that, like the creative or this sort of more nurturing aspect of the shepherding act.
Yeah.
Versus distracting that destructive, coldly logical side.
Really, really interesting. And I think absolutely right? You're presented with these two figures, one of who is analytical and rigorous and methodical, who's fair and balanced and moderate, but also who doesn't really see the full picture, we might think, because we think the full picture comes from God's point of view. But to be fair, the counterbalance is God does care. There's a lot of pathology here, a lot of pathos. God really cares, but God also isn't able to respond or doesn't choose to respond to the actual accusations themselves. Instead, comes up with these gimmicks to try and avoid ever actually answering the argument. Instead, throwing things to the adversary to keep it busy. So there's an interesting dimension to that creativity, that pathos that we want to believe about God comes at the fact that as a result, God's a bit messy compared to Hasatan. Yeah, Robin.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. I just wonder, I mean, in one sense, it's sort of panic and confrontation and distraction, but the way he's doing it is with the strong billy goat who he thinks will win or will at least not lose.
Yeah.
And is there something there about sort of acknowledging the flaws in the children of Israel, but Job being as close to flawless as he's got, and so the accuser is going to have a hard time finding Job's flaws. Yes. Meanwhile, God accepts our flaws and is going to work with them, but and that's the technique that's going on. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's right. And it fits into this kind of idea of suffering that you often hear, which is that it's the strong people who get the most suffering, which I don't know if it's something I would necessarily counsel anyone with on a regular basis, because I think it can be a really problematic way to talk about what it means to be in pain or to suffer. But there is a notion here, certainly, that God knows Job can handle it. God knows Job is righteous enough to be able to stand up to the accuser, whereas the Israelites at this time are, the accuser is right? Satan is right. They're not very good. So God has to protect them from the accusations. But there is a cost, right? Someone has to face the accuser. Someone has to be fighting against it in order to keep it busy. And the idea is that the righteous ones are the ones who do that, right? So there's a very deep idea in rabbinic literature that it's the righteous people who suffer the most. And it's partially because of this idea of kind of they're a sacrifice, they're a distraction, and it allows the people who can't handle the suffering to avoid it and be protected from it, which is both very empowering and very troubling, as many good ideas are. Okay, let's see how they apply this now more towards Yom Kippur. They're going to continue to establish and elaborate on the theme. Jason, I can see you now. Do you want to read for us?
Sure, I'll have a go. I'm on my phone, so...
That's okay.
I've got to move you. Okay, there we go. From here too?
Yeah.
Okay, here too, on this day, we must send him something with which to occupy himself, resembling him. And while he is engaged with it, he leaves Israel alone and does not confront them as the accuser. There is a saying to the contemptible one in the royal palace, give him a little wine and he will praise you before the king. Otherwise he will speak evil, and sometimes superiors of the palace convey those words, on account of which the king imposes punishment. What happened?
We got you.
Rabbi Yitzhak said, this may be compared to a fool who stands before the king. Give him some wine, and then tell him and show him all those deviances you have committed and all those bad deeds, and he will come and praise you, saying that there is no one in the world like you.
Okay. So we get this other image here, right, coming from a very medieval context. Remember, the authors of the Zohar were largely people living in very chivalrous medieval Spain, knights and courts and kings and favors. And they have this really interesting idea relative to a court, meaning a royal court, about how to deal with the person who says all the bad stuff. What's the trick?
Is to confuse them by getting them a little bit drunk, soften the brain a bit.
Yeah, booze him up, right? Rather than try and fight against him, right? You should, give him something to drink, and then he'll end up praising you, right? Because if you don't do that, he'll speak evil, and other people will hear it, and ultimately the king will hear it and punish you for it. So the best thing is not to fight against the person who, you know, is there to spy or to smack talk. Best thing is to be their friend and, you know, get them a little inebriated, and, you know, you can even tell them all the bad stuff you did, right? You can tell him and show him all the deviancies you've committed and all those bad deeds, and he'll end up praising you because he's confused and drunk and doesn't really know what's going on.
Yeah, it's almost comical.
Yeah.
It's like a farce almost,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the jester, right? That's the image, the fool who stands before the king. Part of the jester's role in a lot of these courts was not too different from prosecutor, right? It was to make fun of people. It was kind of hard stand-up comedy, insult comedy. It's why they got, you know, ended up with their head cut off a lot, because they insulted the wrong person. That was part of the entertainment. And the idea is, you know, lest they say something about you, best thing is just to be on their side and you know, get them to think it's funny, and then they'll say nice things about you. So we want to bribe Satan, right? That's our approach, is rather than try and say, no, God, Satan's wrong, we didn't do this bad stuff. Instead, we're going to try and bribe Satan to say, oh, well, here, have this goat full of our sins. We'll push it off the cliff. You'll love it. And then they'll end up saying all of our positive praises instead of accusing us of bad stuff. What do you make of that? Is that a good approach to dealing with the accuser?
Interested in the use of the word resembling him.
Yes, good note, good observation. So what do you imagine that means? Remember, we're talking about one of the two goats.
Well, so I don't know. I was wondering if maybe like mirroring would be a better word, but something like something equally forceful, like a good match to keep him busy enough.
It may be that, right? The way that Job was righteous enough to keep the wolf busy fighting it. I think there's also maybe a hint here of the fact that the authors of the Zohar were well aware of Christian theology at the time, right? And Christian theology of the time and today often imagined Satan as the devil, as having goat features, right? That's the whole kind of mythology around Baphomet and all these other things, which largely comes from Babylonian demonology. So the association of Satan and goats is pretty deep, right? That's the cloven hooves and the horns and all of that in Christian mythology. I think there might be a little hint here that they kind of have that in mind, because what we're talking about is giving the goat off the cliff, and the resembling him, if it means physical resemblance, might indicate that they're thinking of that, even if they wouldn't say it, which is interesting. Okay. Let's go on. So we're seeing the other side of the parable. Jason, do you want to read a bit more?
Okay. I'll turn you that way.
Sorry.
That's right. Here too, the denouncer is standing constantly before the king. The people of Israel present him this gift, in which is a list of all the bad deeds, all the deviances, and all the sins that they have committed, and he comes and praises Israel and becomes their defender. The Blessed Holy One transfers everything onto the head of his people, since it is written, "For you are heaping live coals on his head, and God will reward you."
Okay, I'll just pause you there for a second. So, what are we doing? What's the other side of the parable in terms of getting the fool drunk? How do we get the accuser, Hasatan, drunk?
Well, you give him all the bad deeds, but you don't give it by individuals, and that's what we pray in Yom Kippur. Often, they're like a group. We don't say we've done it. We've said we in the wider sense.
Exactly. Sound familiar? Right? We stand there and we say, this is all the bad stuff we've done. Now, we usually think of that as we're telling God, right? We're confessing to God. We're saying, listen, this is all the bad stuff we did. The Zohar imagines that those confessions, the Ashamnu, the Al-Chet, all the Vidui stuff that we do in Yom Kippur, actually is not to tell God about the bad stuff we did, but to kind of feed the accuser, to get him drunk on all of our bad stuff. We say, oh, we murdered and we killed and we stole and here's all the bad stuff we did. And he loves it so much that he just gets totally intoxicated by it, to the extent that actually he forgets to accuse us and ends up praising us. Which is wild, right? That's who we're giving that to when we do it. It actually makes a kind of sense because, of course, God already knows, right? Why are we reciting this list, this pro forma list of stock sins? We say it in the first person plural, maybe to include everyone, maybe just because we're kind of, teasing the accuser, saying, oh, here's all this bad stuff we did, and he loves it, and it keeps him busy.
That feels quite the opposite of the Job story, right? The sort of getting intoxicated on all of the sins versus the let's distract him with the righteous one who he's going to really struggle to pin the sins on.
Yeah. Absolutely. They're not necessarily compatible images. We had the image of the goat and the wolf, and we have this image of the fool getting drunk, and they're coming from two different rabbis who are in a discussion around this, so they don't necessarily match too well, and they are quite different, right, in terms of what we're doing when we do tshuva and how that relates to the accuser, whether we're feeding it or whether we're fighting it, are pretty different.
So it's your kind of classic distraction / diversion tactics of, hey, look over there.
Exactly. Look over there. Exactly that, right? It's the throwing the steak behind you as you're running to get the dog busy. It's anything to distract. It's illusion, right? Ultimately, we're the one doing the magic here. It's sleight of hand. As we're busy praying to God, saying how God's going to forgive us, we're telling the adversary all of our bad stuff so that the adversary also goes, yeah, they're cool. And when the gates close at the end of the day, we're fine, right? We're working the system, manipulating the factors involved in order to try and get the outcome to be in our favor.
Makes you think of like a business like it's under investigation for something and it leaks something intentionally, something inflammatory, so that distracts the press. Yes. They go after that really, so that the bigger challenge actually sort of slips under the radar.
Absolutely, really good. It's disinformation campaigns that governments go on in order to try and confuse their enemies. Absolutely, right? This is our divine disinformation, which we're trying to make sure that Hasatan is something he likes, but not something that's accurate, so that we can get on with the business of actually going through Yom Kippur and getting out the other side.
It's like the original social media, isn't it?
Maybe. Maybe it's certainly distracting enough. Right, let's read on a bit more. Janice, do you want to read for us from Rabbi Yossi?
Rabbi Yossi said, woe to the people of Ezra when this goat is sent to the denouncer who is appointed over them, since for its sake he comes to praise Israel, and the blessed Holy One diverts all those sins onto the head of his people, because it is written, a speaker of lies will not endure my eyes. Rabbi Yehuda said, if the nations of the world knew of this goat, they would not let Israel be for a single day in the world.
Okay, so just on these two statements here, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, it's kind of a tangent, right? But they are just kind of reflecting on the fact that there's also a interpersonal, intercommunal dimension to this. Because the implication is the people of Esau is a metonym in rabbinic literature for Christians, originally for Rome, and then later for Christianity in general. And there's a sense here that all the stuff that we pretend we're confessing or that we are actually confessing, although we're not held accountable for it, it kind of bounces back on other people, right? That ultimately it rebounds and ends up affecting other people and hurting other people, which is perhaps a really negative outcome of this. We get off scot-free by virtue of our illusion, but actually there's still a negative consequence because it ends up on someone else's head, right? That's the whole scapegoat imagery of Leviticus 16. We take our stuff and put it on the goat and then push the goat off the cliff, right? So the idea here that Rabbi Yossi says is that ultimately this actually hurts someone, just not us, which is obviously problematic. And Rabbi Yehuda clearly believes the same because of this statement that if they knew what we were doing, they would never let us be, right? That actually we're doing some kind of magic to hurt other people by virtue of our own absolving of our crimes. Yeah, Robin.
So is that just a way of saying, look, it's not that easy? You can't just sort of wash away all the bad stuff. There are consequences for doing it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the underlying thing here has consistently been somebody has to pay the price, right? Yes, God can get the Israelites across the Red Sea, but Job has to go instead, right? It's a substitutionary sacrifice. And that is, of course, what Leviticus 16 is telling us. Rather than us die because of our crimes, we're going to put them on this goat, and the goat is going to be pushed off the cliff. It's a substitution for us. Rather than we get pushed off the cliff, the goat gets pushed off the cliff. You can see the same imagery in the Akedah story. Rather than Abraham having to kill his son, he kills the ram that shows up instead. It's a substitution for him. Somebody still has to die. Right? Blood is still spilt. And there's a sense in a very ancient, very pagan way that there's kind of magic has a cost. And when blood is due, blood is needed to be spilled. And our goal is not necessarily to avoid the spilling of blood, but to make sure it's not our blood.
So what happens in the contemporary world where we don't have a goat? What's the thinking process there? Because we haven't got someone to put the sins on unless they're going to other people that are not Jews.
Well, no, exactly. And that's why it's somewhat confusing, because the biblical Yom Kippur is pretty straightforward. Everyone confesses, you put it on the goat goes off the cliff, everyone has a nice day, right? Our Yom Kippur is different. We read about that, and we understand that by reading about it, we're kind of partaking in it in some way, even though that's not what we do. But that's exactly why the Zohar is interested in understanding what our relationship is with Hasatan directly, whether we're kind of feeding it or fighting it or whatever else, because it's not so clear-cut without the biblical model to go off of. And if you think about what we do on Yom Kippur, right, what we add to our prayer services, we add the confessionals, the vidui, in multiple different forms. Many people add the temple service, the Seder HaAvodah, in which you read about the priests' practices on Yom Kippur of biblical times. And we ultimately are kind of trying to evoke this idea that we're doing the same thing even without the goat, that we're in some way taking what's on our chest and putting it somewhere else. Where we're putting it, who that affects, what happens, we often don't think about. We just think it's being absolved. But the assumption of the Zohar, again, from a kind of slightly more pagan, magical point of view, is somebody's got to pay the price, even if it's not us. Nothing comes for free. Every good fairy tale involves someone who thinks they got away with some kind of magic spell and then doesn't understand the consequences. Usually they're catastrophic. Okay, let's read on a bit further. Janice, do you want to read the last paragraph on this page?
Yeah. Come and see, all that day he is occupied with the goat, and meanwhile the Blessed Holy One purges Israel, purifying them entirely, and the accuser does not appear before him. Afterward, he comes and praises Israel. The Blessed Holy One asked him, as it said, Adonai said to the advisory, from where have you come? And he replies in praise of Israel. The accuser turns into a defender and goes his way.
Right. So that's how we remove the danger of Hasatan, right? Is exactly by distracting him. This kind of brings these different threads together. It's the combination of the fool image, the substitution image, the wolf image, right? Is we keep him busy with the goat, at least in the biblical model. And meanwhile, God can get busy purifying us because that's all God wants to do, right? God doesn't want to punish us. God doesn't want to accuse us of anything. God in this is completely on our side. That's one of the benefits of this thinking, is Hasatan is the one who wants to get us in trouble. God just wants to get us off all of the things we did, right? God just wants to get the lambs across the river. God just wants to get the Israelites across the sea to Egypt and doesn't care that they didn't do what they were supposed to do, because of this sense of affection or love or pathos or caring or whatever. So as soon as Satan is distracted, God can purify us and allow us to start over. And by the time Satan is finished with the goat and comes back, he's actually pretty positive about Israel, partially because he's satiated by the goat. Right? We turn the accuser into a defender. That's the image. By feeding it, we turn it from an accuser into a defender, and then he goes on his way until next year.
We're back to the point where God is like a parent and just wants to have good children and doesn't really want naughty children.
Yeah, and to some extent, parents whose children get in trouble with the law often do pretty dramatic things to try and save them from punishments which they are completely well deserved. It's not unusual to see, especially among people who have the money and resources to try and avoid their children, going to jail or suffering the consequences, right? Some rich guy's kid accidentally crashes a boat and kills someone. Unlikely that kid's ever going to go to jail, because that person will do incredible things to try and pay off the right people, bribe the right police, make sure the legal system works in his favor. And that's in some way a very sick and twisted version of love, of parental love. You might say that parental love is letting your children be independent and facing the consequences of their actions, but maybe there's something admirable in the parent who actually go to any length, break any rules to protect their children. Certainly from the children's point of view, it might be quite comforting. In this case, we're the children. Hopefully we're the children, not the goat.
Thinking about how that mechanic would work if you just think of Job in isolation. Because if Job is, so beyond reproach that Job couldn't have a scapegoat because there'd be nothing to put on it, right? So in a sense, by having nothing that Job could actually distract the adversary with, gets consumed by it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Job's life is completely ruined during the story, right? It's like, it's completely unfair. And that's partially feeding into another idea that's behind a lot of this, which is that there's a rabbinic notion that the person who does something wrong and does tshuva is much better than the person who never does anything wrong at all. Right? So if you have made mistakes and you make them right, you're seen as more righteous than the person who just never made a mistake. Because you understand more of what's being done, and maybe because in this way you have something to give the adversary, or you have something to say, yes, I did do this, but look over there. Whereas Job doesn't have that. He's too good. And the problem might be that he's too good. Which is very different. All of this is straying very far from how we normally read Job, how we normally think of Hasatan, how we normally understand Yom Kippur. It's quite a different and, I think, interesting but challenging understanding of what's happening behind all these things. Robin, what were you going to say?
I think I was going to say something quite similar to what Lee said, actually, but it's just, I'm struggling with the different interpretations of the distraction and the different forms of distraction and what they mean for what we're really doing with our sins.
They're not necessarily, they don't always make sense in some way, and they're contradictory. But in both cases, it is a diversion. I think that's the key thing, right? Whether it's us feeding and distracting and plumping up Satan by saying, here's all the bad stuff we did, check it out. Or whether it's us saying, hey, here's a goat, it's full of sins, enjoy that. In either way, it's kind of the same idea that we're using our own confession as a way to divert Satan's attention for long enough, just long enough. It's temporary, but it buys us just enough time for God to do what God always wants to do, but apparently can't do normally, which is to absolve us of everything we've done wrong. Right? God also needs Satan to be distracted, which is interesting.
And is it then that, because I think I was struggling a bit with that bit of him, of Hasatan coming back in defense and in praise of Israel, is that because having been distracted by the goat, he comes back and sees them having post-purification by God and says, oh, actually, these guys are great.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's that. And there's also the element that he's fattened up and happy. Right. And that's the bit about the kind of getting the guy drunk, is like he's so full of all the bad stuff that actually he's just not as bothered anymore. Like, sure, they did some bad stuff, whatever. Whereas in the morning, before we gave him all of our sins, he was really out to get us. By the afternoon, he's just kind of whatever. They're fine. And that's partially something that we've engineered. So it's a combination of the fact that we've kind of buttered him up, and a combination of the fact that by the time he comes back ready to accuse us, we're different. Right, by the time the gates close at the end of the day and he's finished with the goat, we've already been purified. So no, right, too late. And then we go through the same cycle over and over again. And every time he falls for it.
It'd also be like much harder to criticize a group than a single person. So if he spends all that time criticizing one, then comes back and says, okay, now criticize them. Do your job and criticize them. Actually, I'm okay, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Maybe the problem is we have so much bad stuff that there's just not enough time in order to get it all in there, right? That there's too many accusations to make. Whatever the nature of the problem is, what's notable is that the Zohar envisions our solution as being one of going around the law, right? We're not stoically suffering our punishment and saying, yes, we've done this wrong. We accept the consequences. We're trying to work the system. We're trying to game it and game Satan and make sure that he's fed and God's got enough time to get us through and everything's worked out and everyone's distracted. It's a very different understanding of what we're doing on Yom Kippur, slightly less earnest in some way, but also I think kind of empowering because it means that it's actually somewhat in our hands in terms of how we approach it. We have the opportunity to assist God. And that's what's really interesting, of course. God needs an assist. Nowhere does it go, well, God could just tell Satan, you know what, I don't care, I'm going to forgive them anyway. God evidently doesn't have that power. As long as Satan is there and his accusations are accurate, God is a God of truth. So God has to honor the accusations, right? He's got his hands tied behind his back. But we found a loophole, which is that if we get Satan out of the picture for a while, if we start the courtroom while he's still on recess, we can kind of get it all through just in time.
I don't know. I feel like there's another side to this that could be that Hasatan is kind of playing almost like a cog in the machine of tshuva, and actually the one most interested in us being good is the one that's most convinced. Like, it's kind of almost like Hasatan is really working for God, because it's kind of dealing with the negative traits that are like kind of can't come too close to the divine presence. I don't know if I'm going too far off the derech of.
No. I think the point, right? There's an interesting inversion here, which is that without if it weren't for Hasatan, we would never have the ability to do tshuva, right? We need that accusation to be made so that we can then distract him. So there is a weirdly kind of fatalistic thing here about our dependence on it. And by the way, just to remind you, although the Zohar doesn't say it here, the rabbis multiple times recite the same statement that Hasatan, Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, and Yetzer Hara, our psychological inclination towards evil, are all the same thing. Right? So every time we talk about Hasatan, every single time, we could also talk about it as Yetzer Hara. And to take it into a more explicitly psychological direction, right? I don't know if anyone studied Jung. You might realize I'm a big fan of Jung. But Jung's whole thing about the shadow, right, is that you all have a shadow self, a dark part of your personality, an evil or wicked part. And the wrong thing to do is to try and repress it or fight against it or get rid of it or excise it from yourself. That's actually how you break your personality. The right thing to do, says Jung, is to feed it and to get intimate with it, to understand it, to incorporate it back into who you are, to embrace the shadow, right? That's exactly what we're saying here if we look at this psychologically, right? That how we get to tshuva is not by fighting the accusations, but it's by feeding them, by acknowledging it, by distracting that part of ourselves so that the other part can grow and develop and go on. And that's actually very good advice, right? I think it's very true. Most of what Jung said was borrowed from Jewish mysticism, and this is no exception, right? This idea, ultimately, although we talk about Hasatan and we talk about it as mythological, it's also psychological. That we have to embrace the shadow side of ourselves on Yom Kippur, not try and repress it. It doesn't work to repress it. We have to feed it and distract it. Okay, Zachary, sorry. Who is that?
Jason.
Jason, sorry, I can't see you on the screen. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, it almost seems too easy, this redirection or something. And I'm wondering, out of all of that, where's the incentive to do better next year? If you can just turn up and say, hey, look over there, and again, and, where does that come in then? Like, it doesn't sit right with me in the sense of you should do good kind of thing.
I think an extremely valid point, right? The assumption of the Zohar, again, it has more pagan assumptions than most Jewish sources, we might call them. And one of those is that things don't really change. Things go round and round and round. Time is mostly circular and not linear. And one of those as well is a kind of maybe Christian influence that basically we're never going to get rid of the bad side, right? We're always going to make bad choices. We're always going to do bad things, which is also Jung's claim, right? That we always have a shadow that's inside of us. And the rabbis say the same. We always have the Yetzer Hara. So since we can't get rid of it entirely, we at least have a tactic to try and heal it. I don't think that should be a justification for us to do bad things. And certainly the rabbis, in other words, say you can't plan to sin and then repent on Yom Kippur. It doesn't work, right? They say that explicitly many times. So I think if we understand it in that context, what we're talking about is the unplanned, unstoppable things that inevitably come up, right? No matter how good we try to be, chances are we're never going to get it completely right. Right, there's always going to be something. That's why we stand there on Wednesday night. We're going to stand there and say, all the vows and all the claims and all the promises I make, I'm going to annul them now because I know I might fail to do some of them. And that's the kind of fatalistic element of this, which I think is making you uncomfortable, and rightly so, because we tend to talk about it as we can do better, we can change, this year will be different. But then again, we're there every year. Right? If you're good enough, do you get to opt out of Yom Kippur? I mean, the circularity of the calendar implies that there is some element of it that's always required, which is difficult, perhaps, for us to accept that there's some part of ourselves that's always going to be there and always be dark and always need to be distracted and fed and purified once a year. Consider it regular maintenance every 3,000 miles.
I don't know if any of you guys know there's like this old kind of, I think it's an Eastern kind of story about this like father and a boy, and it's talking about good and evil, and it's like there are two wolves inside you. One of them's like a good wolf and one of them's a bad wolf, and the son says, well, you know, and they're like fighting. And the son's like, well, which one wins? And the father says, whichever one you feed. This is kind of the direct opposite of that. Of like, no, actually, whichever one you feed is the one that's like subdued, is weaker, which I think psychologically makes more sense. We know that the hungrier we are, the more likely we are to behave that way. But that's circular, because then in order to feed the kind of the bad wolf or the Hasatan, you have to do bad things and have some sins to feed. So it's like a never-ending cycle of like, have to sin so I can feed Hasatan, and then I have to like feed Hasatan so that I can get forgiven for my sins.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. That's that kind of circularity that's inherent in this, which is something we might bristle against when we think of Judaism as being primarily about progressive change, linear growth, progressive change. There's also an element of Judaism, certainly the Zohar, which represents this mythological side, which is much less about progressive change and more about circular, magical, naturalistic understandings of how things work. I want to look at one more little bit. I'm going to skip ahead, actually. They get into a kind of thing about the Sfirot and the sprinkling of blood. High priest dips his finger in blood during the ceremony on Kippur, and he sprinkles it up 1 time and down 7 times. There's lots of explanations for why. But naturally, the Zohar kind of sees this and goes, oh, this is about the Sfirot. It goes up 1 time and down 7 times and whatever else. And the conclusion it reaches is that the link to it is our understanding of the Sphira of Binah, which is the feminine, right? The higher feminine Sphira, here called supernal mother. Right? And that's what's going on Yom Kippur. And there's just a really interesting image that's given as a result. Right, they reference the fact that Yom Kippur is plural. Yom HaKippurim is the real title, the Day of Atonements, to understand that there's kind of multiple things happening at once. This is the interesting kind of side bit of it, which is not really related to what we saw before, but is the mythological piece about God. So we had God and Satan before. Now we have 2 different characters, which is the Holy King, right, the male aspect of God, and the Supernal Mother, the female aspect of God. And it's just a different and interesting image around that idea of parental care. So I just want to take a look at this before we wrap up. Zachary, do you want to read this for us?
Sure. From Come and See.
Yeah.
Great. Come and see, the Holy King has left his temple and house in the hands of the Matronita, and has left his children with her so that she may guide them, punish them, and dwell among them. If they are virtuous, Matronita is in joy and honor in the presence of the king. If they are not virtuous, she and they are sent back into exile, as we have already established, for it is written, he who plunders his father puts his mother to flight. Proverbs. And similarly, for your crimes your mother was sent away. Isaiah. Therefore, there is one day a year to examine and inspect them, and when this day comes to pass, supernal mother, in whose hand is all freedom, appears to observe Israel, and they gird themselves on this day with many rituals, prayers, and self-afflictions, all of them virtuous. Then freedom comes upon them from the place of all freedom by the hand of the Matronita. The king's children, her children who have been entrusted in her hands, are all virtuous, all without sin of transgression. Then she couples with the king in radiance, in joy, in perfection, in rapture, for she has raised children fittingly for the supernal king. But when, on this day, they are not found fit, woe to them, woe to their emissary, woe, for Matronita is distanced from the king, and supernal mother withdraws, and no freedom issues from her to the worlds. Happy are Israel, whom the blessed Holy One has taught, so that they may be delivered from judgment, and be found worthy before him, as it is written. For on this day atonement will be effected for you, to purify you. Leviticus. And similarly, I will sprinkle pure water upon you, and you will be pure from all your impurities, and from all your idols I will purify you. Ezekiel.
Right, thank you. So a different image, a different story in some way. What's the understanding of Yom Kippur given here with our two divine parents? We're monotheists, we swear. Well, we've gone from Jung to Freud. Right? What do I mean by that?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I mean, I've always felt that Yom Kippur is supposed to be a happy day because there's a certain expectation that forgiveness is a given, as long as we're sincere, of course, but like forgiveness is a given. But here there's like it's all about like this mother image of like yearning to return to like to please our mothers, basically. But it's also not guaranteed, and there are years of woe where like we fully just fail and like screw the world up for a whole year.
Yeah. Yeah, and the father, right, the king, he's gone. He's absent. He's left us in the care of the queen, and as a result, her punishment is our punishment. If we mess up, when the king shows up to judge us, she's going to be hurt as well. There's a very kind of weird family systems, domestic abuse thing to this, right, which is common in the Zohar. And if we do the right thing, then everyone's happy. We have a happy family. It's the parent trap, right? They're embracing, they're coupling once again. Everyone's good to go. So there's an element of this which is very different in some way than our idea of feeding Satan, getting him distracted, getting him away from us. But it relates similarly to kind of manipulation of the cosmic realm. And that's really what I wanted to try and demonstrate here. Whether or not you buy into the idea of God being a king and a queen, a mother and a father, and the interactions between these two personalities, which, by the way, is pretty explicitly polytheistic. So no objections if you find that troubling. But it's the idea, the deeper idea behind both of these is about what we can do. Right, and that's what's, I think, really interesting. I'm just going to stop the screen share for a minute, because we often think when we look at Yom Kippur that we're there passively. We're there to beat our chests and to fast and to go, we're really sorry, I hope you forgive us. Whereas, Zachary, what you said is largely true. We actually should be a bit more joyful about it, because the assumption is that we will be forgiven. Whether that's the idea that we're going to distract Satan for long enough that God can forgive us just like God wants to, or whether that's the idea that the male and female personas want to be together, and if we are good, then they'll be together, right? Every child of divorced parents thinks that they're just good enough, their parents will get back together, right? That's what's happening here in the Zohar. Either way, the base idea is that we have some ability to manipulate the factors at play. They're much more powerful factors than we are, whether it's Hasatan, the accuser, or whether it's God, or whether it's the king or the queen or whatever. They all have much more power than we do, but our choices and actions and approach to Yom Kippur, in the eyes of the Zohar, affect how those things act and what the results are. So, as usual, there's a really big streak of empowerment here. There's a responsibility that falls on people in order to either distract Satan or get the parents back together or embrace the shadow part of ourselves or whatever it might be. And it's not clear what exactly it is we need to do, but it is clear that we have the power to do it, which is, I think, what's most interesting to me about all of this regarding Yom Kippur, is that it's not usually how we assume we approach today. Other thoughts about all this? I know we kind of two very challenging and different looks, and one only very briefly. But any views on how this is going to affect your view of Yom Kippur this Wednesday, Thursday?
The second part, the mother-father imagery, it makes me think of the sort of mental picture it gives me is of a mother it's sort of like an old school family where the father's quite distant, perhaps. And I've got this image of like the mother bathing the child and preparing them for like a meal with the father, and they still have to be presentable for the father.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, sort of playing off what Zachary said as well, you could have one scenario where the child's playing playful with mother in the bath and smiling and laughing. It's a happy sort of time. Or there's and then the meal goes well and the child's well presented. Or there's this alternative where the child's been out playing so much and they've got chewing gum in their hair and they're just such a mess and they're fighting and they're in the bath and they're not happy about that cleansing process. And by the time the meal comes, the child just isn't ready and they're a mess and the father's disappointed and the mother gets it for that. And that's the picture it painted for me anyway.
Yeah, no, it's beautifully described, although a very different one, hopefully, than most of our families today. No doubt that's the assumption of the Zohar, is this kind of family structure where the mother is responsible and answerable for the behavior of the children to the father, who's responsible for justice and discipline. When we say our prayers on Yom Kippur, just to build on that, Lee, which one are we talking to?
In that concept, it would be the mother. It would be like during that bathing process.
But also, when you say back to Freud, Freud sort of said that the faults of the child are often resulted to the mother, the way the mothers taught them. So you're in another loop again, aren't you?
Absolutely. And that's why she's exiled when we do bad things, is because she's held accountable for our flaws. So there's a dependence there, and an affection there that is potentially codependent, which isn't always bad, right? What's common between these two is the image of God in the first teachings around Satan is the same as the image of God as the mother, right? Who actually doesn't care what we did, doesn't care about justice. That's what the father cares about. That's what Satan cares about. They care about strict justice, about following the rules, about making sure that everything is accurately and fairly distributed. What the mother cares about is love and affection and compassion, right? We talk about God all throughout Yom Kippur as Harachamim, the compassionate one. El Harachamim, Melech Harachamim, over and over and over. The word Rachamim, compassion or mercy, is actually from the word for womb, Rechem. That's the womb, right? In a woman's body. That's the womb that we come from. And that's the idea of mercy, is that kind of maternal affection. Very obviously kind of gender binary to assume that the mother is always the compassionate one, the opposite of what Freud seemed to assume, but absolutely a kind of symbolic idea that when we think about God on Yom Kippur, what is interesting to me, and what I think we should take away from both of these, is that God is the one who doesn't care whether Satan is right or wrong, whether actually we were supposed to be in slavery for another 200 years, whether we've done the right thing or haven't done. God is the one who's trying to help us get out of it, trying to help us get clean and get pure and distract whatever negative things, keep the Father stalled in the other room, keep Satan busy on the other side, so that we can be clean and ready and go ahead to the next year. And I think that that's actually quite a comforting image, right? The way that we talk about God being a comforting mother. However else it's problematic and linked up with abuse and family systems, whatever, there's something about that on a day in which we are quite afraid sometimes, in which we're quite intimidated by the solemnity of it, is actually quite deeply comforting. So whether it's a mother figure in particular versus a father figure, which it doesn't have to be, or whether it's just an idea of God who actually doesn't care that much and just wants us to be okay, I think that's a good thing for us to take into Yom Kippur this week, and something the Zohar, as usual, helps prompt us to think about. So thank you for joining me this evening. Always a pleasure to read and to study and to think about these things. I will post this online, and I'll post the text as well if you want to take another look at it or study it over Yom Kippur. Any insights you come across as you think about it more, please let me know. There's always more and more to mine from it.